What's up guys, and welcome to Drive Steady. I'm a big fan of Corvettes and 911s, so in this video we're going to talk about the new C8 Corvette and the 992 generation 911. We'll compare the two cars, talk specs, and I'll share my thoughts on which one I like best. Before I get started with the topic, I wanted to say thank you to all the people who have subscribed to our channel. I appreciate everyone's time and all the views. Alright, so the 911 and the Corvette. Both models are in the midst of new generations. The Porsche 911 is now entering the 992 generation from the previous 991, and the Corvette is entering the C8 generation from the previous C7. Both of these cars have been around for a very long time and have consistently been evolving since their inception. The C1 Corvette generation originally debuted in 1953, making the Corvette 63 years old. The first year of the 911, codenamed 911, was in 1963, making it 53 years old. I must say that it's an exciting time to be a Corvette and or 911 fan because both of these cars are breaking into the quote-unquote future. As many of you know, the Corvette is now moving to the mid-engine platform to expand its performance bandwidth into the future, and Porsche has basically guaranteed that the new 992 generation will get a hybrid power plant in its life cycle. So what better cars to compare than these two, right? Enough history, now let's jump into the comparison. The first topic I'd like to discuss is the power and torque, of course. Both of these cars get their power figures in different ways. The C8 Corvette has 495 horsepower and 470 foot-pounds of torque through a 6.2-liter naturally aspirated V8 engine. The Porsche 911 Carrera S, on the other hand, pumps out 443 horsepower and 390 foot-pounds of torque through a forced induction 3-liter turbocharged H6 engine. Comparing these two engines, you'll see that the Corvette continues to offer natural aspiration in their base engine, while the Porsche is now using forced induction for all of its 911s, except for the specialty models such as the GT3 and the GT3 RS trim levels. Comparing the power, the Corvette has 52 more horsepower than the Porsche and also tops it with an even wider gap in torque with a difference of 80 foot-pounds. But this comes as no surprise, as the Corvette has always had more horsepower and torque than the 911. You'll see later on, once we go over the performance data, that the Porsche 911 Carrera S punches above its power numbers would suggest. Since these two cars have been around for so long, I thought it would be cool to see how they've evolved throughout their history. First, let's look at the Porsche 911 horsepower and torque figures through its generations. Before I start, I want to mention two things. First, I try to find the most accurate data, so my expectation is that the numbers I've used should be fairly accurate or within the ballpark. Second, is that since there have been so many iterations of the 911 through the first generation 911 with cars such as the 901, the 912, the 930, etc., the approach I'm taking here is the base trim first model year from each generation. So here's the history of the Porsche 911 power from inception through the upcoming 992 generation. It's fascinating to see where the 911 started from, 130 horsepower and 119 foot-pounds of torque in the first generation. It's interesting to see that with each generation you see incremental jumps, most of them in the single-digit percentiles. The outlier represented by the 90% from the original 911 in 1963 to the 964 in 1989 was contributed by several iterations of the original 911 generation sandwiched in between. You can see here in the chart that the original 911 generation by far had the longest life cycle, spanning over 25 years. Looking at the whole picture, from its inception in the 911 generation to the upcoming 992, the 911 horsepower figure has gone up by 249 horsepower from 130 to 379. Now let's look at the Corvette. The Corvette is also going through a similar upward trend with one hiccup in the middle, which I'll explain in a second. The Corvette starts out with 150 horsepower and 223 foot-pounds of torque from a 6-cylinder. Many are surprised by the fact that the original Corvette came with a 6-cylinder, but in fact the Corvette didn't get an 8-cylinder until the 1955 model year. A difference between the Porsche and the Corvette charts is that the increase in horsepower from one generation to the next are much larger in the Corvette. If you're wondering why the C4 generation had such sharp drop-off in power, it was due to a global oil crisis and overall economic climate at the time. From the inception in the C1 generation to the upcoming C8, the Corvette horsepower figure has gone up by 340, from 150 to 490. Two trends I noticed where these cars may be learning from each other. First is the fact that Porsche is now able to dial up the torque due to those turbochargers. Throughout its history, the 911 has always been low on torque, requiring the engine to be revved out to achieve its full potential. But now it's inching closer to the formula that Corvette has had for a while now with the higher torque numbers. The second trend I noticed is the percentage increase in horsepower from the C7 Corvette to the C8 is starting to slow down. It seems like the horsepower increases have been getting smaller and smaller ever since the C5 generation, steadily declining from 15.5 to 13.75 and now 7% from the C7 to the C8 Corvette. Looks like a Porsche trend of incremental jumps in horsepower might be starting to establish itself within the Corvette. And in addition, it seems like the Corvette as a car is changing its strategy from being a big horsepower car to a true well-rounded sports car. Coattailing off of the power numbers, now let's talk 0 to 60 times. The Corvette, when equipped with a Z51 package, gets to 60 in 2.9 seconds. On the flip side, the Carrera 911S, when using the launch control function, sprints to 60 in 3.4 seconds. Of course, these are both the published numbers from each manufacturer. Now, the Corvette hasn't been tested by any magazines, however, the Porsche has. Car and Driver was able to achieve a 0 to 60 time of 3 seconds flat in the 911 Carrera S. It's not a surprise to see the real-world performance of the Carrera S beat out the published numbers from Porsche, as they have been notorious for being conservative with their performance metrics. If you're wondering how the Corvette is able to attain such a low 0 to 60 time with only about 500 horsepower, it's because of the revised gear ratios of the Z51 package, and I bet having that new dual clutch transmission doesn't hurt either. But nonetheless, I'm interested to see if the Corvette is going to live up to that 2.9 second 0 to 60 time. What do you think? You think the Corvette real-world performance will match what's being promised? Next, let's look at the topic that is extremely important for sports cars, and that's weight. The Corvette with the Z51 package comes in at 3,535 pounds. On the flip side, the Porsche 911 Carrera S comes in at 3,382 pounds. The difference in weight between these two cars comes in at 153 pounds, which is a decent amount. Both of these figures are the curb weights of the vehicle, which means they include all fluids and gas, basically everything that makes the car drivable. Here's another interesting chart that shows the evolution of weight for the 911. Again, the jump from the original 911 to the 964 generation is big due to the gap in years. However, the weight increase has been in very small numbers through the generations. Considering that vehicle weight is now the biggest topic every car enthusiast likes to complain about, it's a milestone for Porsche for keeping the weight down in their 911s. The total weight gain from the first generation 911 to the upcoming 992 generation is 973 pounds. Now let's look at the Corvette's weight chart. I was surprised to see that the Corvette has gained very little weight throughout its entire life cycle. A couple years, the Corvette lost some weight from the previous generations, in fact. The biggest dip in weight was from the C5 generation to the C6, where the new one lost 40 pounds compared to the previous generation. I can't remember a modern car within the past maybe 5 to 10 years that has lost weight from one generation to another. Looking at the overall picture, the total weight gain from the first model year of the Corvette in 1953 to the new mid-engine C8 2020 model is 550 pounds. I'm assuming many wouldn't have guessed this, but the Corvette has gained less weight in its 60 years of history versus the Porsche. It's pretty interesting, huh? Next, let's look at the power to weight ratio. It's typically an overlooked statistic, but it's often a clear indicator of how well a car performs. Power to weight is attained by dividing the horsepower by the vehicle weight. The higher the number, the better the car will perform. The Corvette comes in with a power to weight ratio of 1.38 and the 911 at 1.3 even. The difference between the cars is a marginal 0.08, which leads me to believe that these cars will perform similarly. Next is horsepower per dollar. This metric is calculated by taking the price of the car and dividing it by the horsepower. In the C8, each horsepower costs $122.43. In the Porsche, $255.75. That's a gap of $133.32 per horsepower, more than doubling the price per horsepower for the Porsche versus the Corvette. I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, since Porsche has always charged a premium and believe that the 911 is more than just the numbers it produces. Let's talk some quarter mile stats. The Corvette rips through the quarter mile at 11.3 seconds at 121 miles per hour. On the flip side, I couldn't find anything published by Porsche, but Car and Driver was able to run the 911 in 11.3 seconds at 125 miles per hour. So identical quarter mile times, however, the Porsche was able to pull off a higher trap speed. The quarter mile is always an interesting topic for cars like the 911 and the Corvette because it's not really their true playground. These cars are mainly made for racetracks with turns and must have good braking, etc. But because the Corvette and the 911 are so powerful, and when you pair them to fast-shifting dual-clutch transmissions, you get these low quarter-mile times. Next, let's look at the transmissions in these two cars. For the first time ever, the Corvette is going to get a dual-clutch transmission with 8 speeds. As mentioned, there will be no option for a manual in the Corvette. The Porsche, on the other hand, has been offering the PDK transmission for several years now, but in the new 992 generation, it will come with 8 speeds versus 7 speeds, and the added bonus is that Porsche has committed to offering a manual transmission in the 992 generation. I was curious how the two dual-clutch transmissions would match up in the weight category. The Corvette's DCT transmission weighs 341 pounds, while the PDK was weighed in 2012 at 256 pounds, which is almost 100 pounds lighter than the one found in the Corvette. One of the reasons why the Corvette has a heavier transmission is because Corvette made it sturdy enough to handle the extra big power that will most likely come with the higher performance trims. Corvette is just getting into the dual-clutch transmission ring, so they have some opportunity to match the benchmark PDK transmission from Porsche. One thing I wanted to remind everyone of, remember that 153-pound curb weight difference between these two cars? Well, the transmission alone contributes to 100 of those 153 pounds. Now let's talk about top speed. The base version of the Corvette has a top speed of 193 miles per hour compared to 191 in the 911 Carrera S. Both of these cars are plenty fast enough, and the two have very similar top speed performance. Now let's compare the exterior size of both of these cars. The Corvette and the 911 have mostly been the same size throughout recent memory. However, considering that the Corvette has now changed its layout from front engine to rear engine, things have changed a little bit. So in this chart, you can see the length, width, and height of both of these cars. The C8's overall length comes in at 182.3 inches versus the Carrera's 177.9. The overall width, 76.1 to 79.7. The height in the C8 Corvette, 48.6 versus the 911's 51.2, and the wheelbase in the Corvette, 107.2 versus 96.5 in the 911. So the takeaway with the size of these two cars is that the Corvette is longer and lower, while the Porsche is wider and has a shorter wheelbase. Now that we've covered most of the specifications for these two amazing cars, let's talk about what it's going to cost for you to own one. The Corvette comes in at $59,995 and the Porsche 911 Carrera S at $113,300. The major difference between the 911 and the Corvette has always been price. The gap between these two cars is $53,305. You could buy a nice luxury sedan and a Corvette for the price of a 911. Not saying the Porsche isn't worth it, but in previous generations the Corvette wasn't as sophisticated as the 911, hence the price difference was justified. Since the C7 generation, I believe the Corvette is bridging that gap. Now with the C8 moving to the mid-engine layout in addition to a much improved interior, I think there's a strong argument as to how much the Porsche brand is really worth. It goes to show you what an astonishing achievement it is for Chevrolet to build a mid-engine sports car with the performance that has been promised at a price point of $60,000. That pretty much wraps up the comparison. Now I wanted to end this video with a couple thoughts. Both the 911 and the Corvette are amazing cars and have long lineages of performance and great looks. Even though their approaches were different, the basic formula was very similar. Build a dedicated sports car that was fun to drive and sparked an emotion. After being around for over half a century, I would say that both of these cars have been successful in the test of time. I'll leave you with one observation. Let's face it, these cars didn't survive this long because everyone who bought them was a car enthusiast. These cars are status symbols. They prove that you've made it in life or have achieved a lifetime goal of owning a Corvette or a 911. These cars have been attracting different customer bases, which has resulted in one having a larger influence on the car versus the other. Allow me to explain. In 2015, Porsche decided that they would not offer a manual transmission in the new GT3. The Porsche enthusiasts were ready to set the world on fire. I remember the backlash was so strong that by the 2018 model, the manual transmission was back in the GT3. So let's look at the flip side. The C8 Corvette, for the first time since the original C1 generation, will not have a manual transmission. Sure, a lot of people are disappointed, me being one of them. However, I would be shocked if the Corvette community was able to push Chevrolet to a point where a manual transmission will be back in the Corvette. These are the subtle differences between these two brands. Differences that go outside all the numbers I've covered in this video. These are the intangible things that don't get factored into the window sticker price but are noticed, mainly by the Porsche community. The Corvette and the 911 have been my favorite sports cars for quite some time. Each have their own charm and appeal and are special in their own ways. And that's why I don't think I would be able to pick between the two. What about you? Which one would you pick? Thanks for watching. Until next time, drive steady.